On the morning of January 20, 2022, before most Minnesotans had woken up, federal agents moved quietly through snow-covered neighborhoods across the Twin Cities. In St. Paul, Minneapolis, Apple Valley, Bloomington, and nearby suburbs, teams from the FBI Minneapolis field office, working alongside IRS Criminal Investigation and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, executed coordinated search warrants tied to a nonprofit that had rapidly risen to prominence during the COVID-19 pandemic. By mid-morning, agents were seen carrying boxes of documents, computers, and hard drives out of offices and private homes connected to Feeding Our Future. News spread fast. A nonprofit that claimed to be feeding thousands of hungry children was now under federal investigation. At the center of the unfolding case was Aimee Bock, the organization's founder and executive director. Minnesota in early 2022 was still navigating the aftershocks of the pandemic. Schools had only recently returned to in-person instruction. Food insecurity remained elevated, particularly in immigrant and low-income communities. State agencies were under intense pressure to account for how billions in federal relief dollars had been spent. The idea that a charity operating in plain sight may have siphoned off hundreds of millions of dollars intended for children landed with a thud. But for federal investigators, the January raids were not a surprise. They were the culmination of a long and methodical investigation. Aimee Bock was not a stranger to government-funded programs. Born and raised in the Midwest, she lived in Apple Valley, Minnesota, and built her career in child care and nutrition services. These programs are largely invisible to the public, but deeply dependent on trust. Federal dollars flow to states. States rely on sponsors, and sponsors are expected to verify that meals are actually being served. Bock understood that system intimately. In 2016, she founded Feeding Our Future, a nonprofit incorporated in Minnesota and headquartered in St. Paul. Its stated mission was to help feed children from low-income families through federally funded nutrition programs administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and overseen in Minnesota by the Minnesota Department of Education, MDE. Feeding Our Future positioned itself as a sponsor responsible for recruiting meal sites, training operators, reviewing paperwork, and submitting reimbursement claims. For several years, the nonprofit operated without attracting significant attention. It sponsored a modest number of sites and processed a few $1 million annually. In 2019, Feeding Our Future received approximately $3.4 million in federal reimbursements. It looked, at least on the surface, like a typical mid-sized nonprofit in the child nutrition space. Everything changed in March 2020. When COVID-19 hit Minnesota, schools shut down almost overnight. For many children, school meals were their primary source of daily nutrition. Congress responded by authorizing emergency funding, and the USDA issued sweeping waivers to speed food distribution. New sites could be approved quickly. Meals could be served off-site. Children did not need to be present to receive food. Oversight requirements were relaxed to prioritize speed over verification. For Aimee Bock, those changes opened the door to explosive growth. Beginning in April 2020, Feeding Our Future began submitting applications for new meal sites at a staggering pace. Restaurants, small storefronts, community centers, and newly formed nonprofits were enrolled across Minnesota. Many had no prior experience with federal food programs. Under the emergency rules, that was no longer disqualifying. On paper, these sites claimed to serve thousands of meals per day. By late 2020 and throughout 2021, Feeding Our Future's reimbursement claims soared into the tens of millions of dollars per month. At its peak, the nonprofit was responsible for processing roughly $40 million in federal meal reimbursements in a single month, an unprecedented figure in Minnesota. Internally, MDE staff began raising serious concerns. Emails later introduced at trial showed officials questioning how newly approved sites could possibly serve the volumes they claimed. When MDE attempted to slow approvals or request additional documentation, Feeding Our Future pushed back hard. Bock accused the department of discrimination and threatened litigation. In 2021, her nonprofit sued MDE in Ramsey County, seeking a court order to resume payments after the state froze reimbursements over compliance concerns. That lawsuit would later be cited by prosecutors as part of a broader strategy to intimidate regulators and keep money flowing. According to federal prosecutors, Feeding Our Future was no longer acting as a legitimate sponsor. Instead, it had become the center of a vast fraud scheme. More than 250 meal sites were allegedly created or sponsored to generate reimbursement claims, many of which existed largely on paper. Attendance rosters listed thousands of children per day. Meal count sheets showed impossible numbers. Invoices billed for food that was never purchased or could never have been prepared at the claimed locations. Federal funds flowed rapidly. Money moved from the USDA to the state, from the state to Feeding Our Future, and from Feeding Our Future to site operators and vendors. From there, prosecutors said, large portions were kicked back through shell companies, fake consulting agreements, and coordinated cash withdrawals. Bank records showed transfers timed precisely to reimbursement deposits. The government estimated that nearly $250 million was fraudulently obtained between April 2020 and January 2022. As the money poured in, so did signs of excess. Prosecutors presented evidence of luxury vehicles, including high-end SUVs and sports cars, expensive watches, designer clothing, and lavish travel. Some defendants purchased homes in suburban Minnesota costing well over $1 million. Others wired large sums overseas. The lifestyle bore no resemblance to the nonprofit's mission of feeding children during a crisis. By mid-2021, MDE concluded it could no longer certify Feeding Our Future's compliance and halted payments. The department also referred its findings to federal authorities. The FBI, IRS Criminal Investigation, and U.S. Postal Inspection Service opened a formal criminal investigation, tracing money flows and visiting meal sites. Agents found empty rooms, locked doors, and no evidence of large-scale food distribution. That investigation came into public view on January 20, 2022, with the coordinated raids across the Twin Cities. On September 20, 2022, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Minnesota unsealed indictments charging 47 defendants, including Aimee Bock, with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, federal programs bribery, and money laundering. Acting U.S. Attorney Lisa D. Kirkpatrick called the case a massive betrayal of public trust, stating that defendants exploited a national emergency to steal money meant to feed children. FBI Minneapolis Special Agent in Charge Alvin M. Winston Sr. described the fraud as staggering in scale and scope. Bock was arrested and made her first appearance in U.S. District Court for the District of Minnesota in Minneapolis. She pleaded not guilty and was released under strict conditions, including surrendering her passport. The case that followed was sprawling. Because of the number of defendants, the court divided it into multiple trials. Some defendants pleaded guilty and cooperated. Others went to trial. Throughout 2023 and 2024, juries heard testimony describing fabricated paperwork, shell companies, and kickback arrangements. Witnesses detailed how sites were created solely to generate claims and how money was divided among participants. Feeding Our Future consistently emerged as the central hub. Aimee Bock's own trial began in early 2025. Before U.S. District Judge Nancy E. Bracel. Prosecutors argued that Bock was not a passive administrator, but the architect of the scheme. They presented emails showing her pressuring state officials, bank records tracing funds to personal spending, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. The defense argued that pandemic chaos and lax federal oversight created confusion and that Bock relied on documentation provided by others. On March 19, 2025, after a 6-week trial, the jury found Bock guilty on multiple counts, including wire fraud and conspiracy. In court, prosecutors emphasized the extraordinary scale of the loss and the harm done to public trust. In 2026, Judge Bracel issued the final judgment in the case. The court entered a formal conviction and imposed a sentence reflecting the severity of the fraud, including a lengthy term of imprisonment, supervised release, and mandatory restitution. The judge ordered extensive forfeiture, including cash, vehicles, luxury goods, and any remaining assets traceable to the fraud. In her ruling, Judge Bracel stated that the crime represented an extraordinary abuse of trust and emphasized that emergency programs cannot function if those entrusted to administer them exploit them for personal gain. The court acknowledged that much of the stolen money could not be recovered, having been spent or transferred beyond reach, but stressed that accountability and deterrence were paramount. The judgment closed the central chapter of one of the largest pandemic-related fraud cases in U.S. history. The story of Aimee Bock and Feeding Our Future is a stark reminder of how systems built on trust can be manipulated during moments of crisis. What began as a nonprofit claiming to feed children ended in raids, trials, convictions, and a 2026 federal judgment. On that cold January morning in 2022, when agents carried boxes of evidence out of offices across Minnesota, the illusion collapsed. Years later, with the judgment entered and sentences imposed, the case continues to shape how governments design and monitor emergency aid, and how communities reckon with betrayal carried out in the name of charity. Thanks for watching. This case raises serious questions about trust, oversight, and how emergency aid can be abused when systems are under pressure. What do you think about the Feeding Our Future scandal and Aimee Bock's role in it? Share your thoughts in the comment section. If you found this video informative, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you do not miss future videos.